I've got the sign that this is now live on YouTube. So second time lucky. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Apologies, we are slightly late. We've had some minor technical difficulties, but hopefully now you can hear me and you can see the lovely panel that we have today. So I guess let me introduce All Good. I've got the All Good message, so you should be able to see us. So today we are speaking about the barriers facing Muslims with regards to education in the UK. And this webinar has been set up by the Community Policy Forum, which is an independent think tank that seeks to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policy making surrounding structural inequalities that Muslims and Muslim communities face in the UK. My name is Sadiq. I am the co-founder of Muslim Census, which is, now I read the description of Community Policy Forum, it's slightly similar. We collect data and insights into issues and everything else surrounding Muslims in this country as well. We are joined by the recently knighted Sir Stephen Timms, the MP of East Ham. We have Dr. Reza Gholami, who is currently a reader in Sociology of Education at the University of Birmingham. And we also have Asha Hassan, who is a final year med student and a student campaigner who I've had the pleasure working quite closely with over the past, well, less than a year on one of the campaigns that we will speak about later today as well. So I think what we're going to do is make this very much, initially start off with a bit of a question and answer, but feel free if everyone else has input into some of the questions that we ask as well. Stephen or Reza, Asha, feel free to jump in as well. But we'll start off with the campaign that I mentioned around alternative student finance, Asha. So you've campaigned extensively for the introduction of alternative student finance or a Sharia compliant student finance option. Could you give a bit of a brief background into alternative student finance in the UK and why you think it's such an important issue?
So this is a very, very protracted issue, unfortunately. So it goes back, 10, 12 years. So obviously the government sort of was planning to change the student finance system back in 2010, and they implemented it in 2012. At the time, they did an equality impact assessment to see how this would affect students and how the changes could provide more barriers. Of course, changing the interest rates to above inflation and also tripling the fees meant that it would be very inaccessible for a lot of students. And they knew this was already raised with them. So in 2013, David Cameron made an announcement that never again should a Muslim in Britain feel unable to go to university because they cannot get a student loan simply because of their religion. So they acknowledged this, they know this was the problem. And in 2014, there was a consultation that was put out, given a solution and asking the Muslim community if they would be happy with this solution. And this solution would be based on a takaful system. It would provide no advantage to Muslim students, anyone could access it, but it would not be based on interest. So they had the solution in 2014, they consulted the community, and we responded quite significantly. We had 20,000 people chiming in at that time, and that broke the record for the number of submissions on any consultation that has ever been put out. So we made a really big, we really did raise our concerns with the government, and that from their point, they knew they had to do something. So they were working on this behind the scenes, and in 2017, they also changed the legislation to make it available so that the Secretary of State could offer this loan. But since then, things have sort of died down. There's not been much movement from the Department for Education, simply because it wasn't a political priority, and so they didn't do nothing. And unfortunately, from our side, we weren't really pushing that and raising our concerns. And if you looked at the psyche of the Muslim communities, they'd given up by that point. They weren't aware of what was happening behind the scenes. And so they just thought, there's no change. We're going to have to accept this. Either you go to university or you don't. And that's something you have to, bear the weight of. And it's quite unfortunate because the people who have to bear the most weight are those who are the least fortunate, who can't afford it, who don't have family members supporting them. And it's been this way for far too long. And so we've really pushed the government, mostly in the last year. And just by coming together, I really think it's made a massive difference. I think it's been the collaborative, collective approach that's really worked. So people, have played their part, however small. People have been going to their MPs and sitting with them and talking to them about this issue. You did the data sets that gave us that really, really important data. And people have been, sharing on their platforms to getting people to write into consultations, etc. So that collaborative, collective approach has really made a difference. And from September, when me and Steve and Tim sat down with the university minister, and she was very clear to say they could backtrack on their commitment because they weren't feeling the strength of this issue in our community. To a meeting we had only a month ago, and where she was very clear to say, we do understand, we hear you, we are going to work on this. And Nadeem Zahawi did reaffirm the commitment in May last month. So we did make a really big difference simply because we came together and simply because we raised that concern. So alhamdulillah, it just shows what can happen if we do come together, and it just shows how it shouldn't have taken this long.
Yeah. Stephen, on that, how did this issue get brought to your awareness, and what was your take on students?
Well, I've been aware of the issue for some time. I was aware of it when David Cameron made his initial commitment in 2013 that, as Asha has said, no Muslim student should have to not go to university simply because of their faith. So I've been aware of it since then, but I think credit where credit's due. I think the huge energy that Asha has invested in this over the last year or two has made a big difference. She's been absolutely determined and focused on it, and has made big waves. And as she said, when David Cameron made his announcement, I think it was perfectly genuine. I think he meant it, and there was quite a lot of work done subsequent to that to deliver on the commitment. But at some point, it all kind of ran into the sand. And Asha and I spoke to the university's minister last September, and we said, well, the Prime Minister made a commitment. And she said to us, well, we've had two prime ministers since then, which sort of implied that, the commitment didn't really stand anymore, or at least it certainly wasn't clear that it did. As she said, though, when we spoke to the same minister much more recently, there did seem to be a much more positive view of this issue. And then the Secretary of State did confirm a fortnight ago that the government is still committed to doing this. Now, we don't know when they're going to do it. We're waiting for a consultation, which is underway at the moment. And, it is still possible this could run into the sand again. But I think we have got the government into a much better place now. And what everybody needs to do is to keep up the pressure through their own members of parliament, just to make sure that we don't lose it again. Because you never know, we might have another change of prime minister coming up. We don't want this to disappear again for a few more years.
I'm sure that's keeping you busy recently, Stephen.
It certainly has. One other point I would make is that the figures you came up with, I think, are really helpful. The fact that we can now tell people that the estimate is that 6,000 students a year who could go to university are not going to university because they haven't got the opportunity of student finance, which they can, in good conscience, take up. That, I think, is a really powerful and helpful figure, just to put a sense of what the scale is on this problem. And of course, on top of all those people, there's other people who do go to university, who do take up the current student finance system and feel bad about it the whole of their university life. And, the system shouldn't be doing that to people. So the extra evidence you've given us has been really helpful.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think that's a very good place to start off with when we're talking about barriers facing Muslims in education. The barrier of access in the first place is, of course, one of the biggest. Moving on to yourself, Reza, you've carried out research into the Muslim awarding gap in UK universities. Could you please, I guess, touch on your findings and what you feel should be done to address this particular issue?
Sure, yes. I mean, we now have data for the first time, released just pre-pandemic, actually, by HISA, that is nationally representative, and that shows that Muslim students or students who claim a Muslim identity are by far the lowest performing or the lowest awarded, I think, students by religion in the UK. And the findings are really quite stark. I mean, there's a really big gap. I think if we combine the sort of first class and 2-1, the good honors, so-called degrees, only about 65% or so of Muslim students manage to achieve a good honors, compared to, I think it's close to 89% of, say, Jewish students, or around 80% of students with no religion or students from Christian backgrounds. So there really is quite a big gap. Sort of the key question is, why is that happening? I think what Asha and Stephen have touched on sort of, is beginning to hint in that direction. There seems to be, on a kind of experiential and qualitative level, there seems to be some difference in that students of Muslim backgrounds are experiencing when they're at university. And there has been, some research into this, not just from the UK, but other European and indeed North American countries. And some of the sort of key issues that keep coming up in the various reports and literature on this, really do put the blame kind of squarely at the door of racism and Islamophobia. And I think, certainly from my perspective, it is important to at least partially separate, given the current political climate, distinguish somewhat between racism and Islamophobia. I don't think you can just chalk it all up to racism and assume that it covers everything. I think, as I said, there's some uniqueness now in the post 9/11, post prevent policy world. There is some uniqueness to the Muslim student experience in particular. And so, speaking to Muslim students themselves, there's some really excellent work done by the NUS, for example, and by a number of academics and others. Islamophobia and racism, unfortunately, continue to be reported really widely on campuses across the UK and, as I said, other Western countries. Muslim students seem to be very readily, very easily associated with extremism and terrorism, which again is something that is probably well known, particularly among Muslim populations. And this is one of those unique aspects which kind of really requires analysis in its own right, that our sort of traditional understandings of racism probably don't cover as well. That this is about the problematization of the belief and of the faith of a community, which lends itself to this kind of ascription, to this kind of association with extremism, terrorism, and other very negative concepts such as, just irrationality, misogyny, homophobia, that sort of thing. And it's interesting that David Cameron was mentioned, because it was during his tenure as Prime Minister that that key shift in the counterterrorism discourse happened, where the focus was no longer on just sort of preventing acts of violent extremism. The focus of the counterterrorism kind of policy became really about targeting extremist ideology specifically. So the idea of belief and the idea of people's belief systems and their problematization really became quite sharply focused on. We also know that Islamophobia tends to affect Muslim students, female Muslim students much more, partly because of their visibility. But as some people have said, they're both very visible, but also at the same time, they tend to be invisible as well. Also very sadly and somewhat surprisingly, the discrimination and the Islamophobia that the Muslim students often have to experience, this happens despite the fact that several surveys have shown that actually British and Western Muslims in general tend to identify really strongly with their countries, and by that I mean their Western countries, the countries that they were born and raised in, and of which they're citizens. They do identify; they take a lot of pride in being British or American or Canadian or whatever, and the discrimination and the Islamophobia happens in spite of that. And I've already mentioned prevent as a kind of a final issue, but there's just no way around that. That keeps coming up again and again and again in interviews with Muslim students, that you know, this kind of the sort of suspicions that come with that. You know, and again, it goes back to what Stephen was saying before, that you know, essentially there's a whole host of factors that lend themselves to Muslim students having, in addition to the traditional challenges of being a student in higher education, having to hand in essays and doing exams and all the rest of it. There's also, you know, all these other issues which really weigh on somebody's mind in terms of causing anxiety. There's a lot of worry about whether or not people's faiths and their kind of their piousness is being questioned. Or is being potentially compromised simply by being a student in higher education. So these seem to be the sort of key issues that I think we really have to examine really quite seriously if we want to get to the heart of the Muslim student awarding gap.
Yeah, and I guess touching quite directly on one thing that you mentioned there, Reza, is about the PREVENT program. And there are numerous Muslim organizations, including the Federation of Islamic Societies, FOSIS, that have called for the government to scrap this program. However, there are supporters that argue that the program is, I guess, crucial to tackling extremism, including on university campuses. I wanted to get your take on that, Stephen. What are your thoughts on the PREVENT program?
I think the optics around PREVENT are bad, and the name doesn't help. I mean, I think there are perfectly valid and useful things that are being done under the, you know, using the funds which the Home Office disperses under the PREVENT heading, but the whole vibe around it is that, you know, they're trying to stop people, and I think I'd certainly like to see it rethought, and I think we should be talking in terms of, you know, safeguarding or supporting rather than preventing. You know, no doubt some of the things that are done under PREVENT shouldn't be being done at all, but some of them definitely should be, and you know, there is an issue, there is a need to protect communities, I think, and we need funding to be provided to do that. But I don't think the approach that's been taken, certainly in the last 12 years, under the PREVENT banner has really helped.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I wanted to touch again on, Reza, you mentioned the HISA findings about Muslims having that massive gap in award in terms of achieving 2-1 or first. So now we have that. What do you think are the next steps of what we should really be zooming into and finding out more about?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? It's that's a difficult one. I mean, I think it's certainly from my view, it's safe to say that the current strategies and the policies are probably ineffective, sometimes to the point of being frustrating. And you know, there are certainly strategies in place. I mean, the OFS has pledged to get rid of the BAME awarding gap, because I mean that's the kind of wider context of this by 2030. It isn't quite clear on how this is meant to be done, and I think it's just leaving that to the sector, which is fair enough. I mean, I think the sector should deal with this, but then we run into several layers of very complex institutional policy then. I think in terms of, you know, sort of what is currently being done, you know, some of the strategies that have been in place, there is a recognition now more widely across the sector that yes, there is an awarding gap, that just the acknowledgement of calling it an awarding gap rather than an attainment gap, that in itself is a big step. It tends to be subsumed under the BAME kind of category, which I don't think is helpful. So I think that that's part of the problem. In the case of Muslims, one of the uniqueness again of the Muslim situation is that, well, not all Muslims are BAME. Some are white. Some Muslims are white converts. And there is really interesting research to show that even when white people convert to Islam, upon conversion, they often become seen by other white people as almost having become brown. So there's a kind of a racialization that goes along with being Muslim. And again, that's one of the complexities that the current strategy doesn't really deal with. The other strategy has, which has been in fashion for some time in higher education, has been the sort of internationalization strategy, which had alongside it a kind of a big move to try to be more inclusive and to try and sort of, cater for more academic and cultures of learning and also just, people's cultures. But again, the issue there is that the vast majority of Muslim students in the UK are home students. They're British. They're not international. And the problem with internationalization policy tends to be that it, you might accuse me of being very cynical here, but it does seem to be linked to the sector's kind of financial agenda. I mean, it has been linked to universities trying to kind of sustain their funding and their income. So the kind of inclusion bit seems to be almost secondary to it. There's sort of also kind of smaller, more sort of immediate strategies. Asha's back. Some people have called for religious literacy training. Again, I'm not sure how helpful this sort of thing is. I think clearly there's some merit in gathering a bunch of people together and going through the kind of stereotypical lists of, what different religions do, what they celebrate, etc. But given the complexity of that we see in all religions, not least Islam, that doesn't seem to be really kind of going to the heart of things. People have talked about better mechanisms for reporting Islamophobia and racism, and again, that's absolutely fine. That's important, but I would remind people that those policies have already existed. They've already existed. They've always been in existence, and yet we have these awarding gaps. I think if we're really serious about tackling these issues, we really do have to be willing, as a community of learning, that this is the sector, the students, the lecturers, government, policymakers, everybody really. We have to be willing to sort of really look at depth at the complexities of the issues. Just sort of subsuming everything under the BAME umbrella, that's never going to work. I think so. I mean, and two sort of immediate steps. It's about shoring up the kind of our intellectual underpinning of where the problem even comes from. We do need a proper theory of racism, and we need to understand, because for me, I think, the Muslim student issue, as I've said, racism is a huge part of it, both in its institutional and other forms, but also Islamophobia, or what I think of as religification, the kind of the reduction of this vastly diverse population of Muslims or people from Muslim backgrounds to a kind of an imagined, very myopic understanding of Islam. That's another part of it. So we need a proper theory of racism to really get to grips with how racism operates. And if anything, the current climate, the current government is making that far, far too difficult. I mean, I only refer people to the publication of the Sewell report not long ago, which is playing down institutional racism, which is deeply problematic. If anything, it seems like we're sort of stepping backwards rather than going forwards in our understanding of racism. We have to move away from this kind of understanding of the world as somehow post-racial or colorblind, or because none of the data that we have would back that up. And then the second issue would be to really focus on the kind of religious aspects of this, which again, our traditional understanding of racism doesn't really allow us to understand, not least because, as wonderful as that tradition of work and activism is, it is ultimately a secular form of politics. And I don't think it's quite equipped to understand the specific difficulties that people with religious faith have to go through in what is either a very secular educational setting, or which is deeply steeped in sort of Christian traditions, in many universities, especially the kind of really elite ones in the UK. And as a final point, I mean, it's quite clear, because we have some of the most prominent scientists and academics on the planet in the UK and elsewhere whose essential belief is that religious people are kind of dumb, they're a bit irrational, they're a bit stupid. Do they actually really belong in an intellectual space? And although you wouldn't utter those words, the institutional habitus tends to mirror that kind of understanding. So I think these are the kinds of issues, and it's only once we start from that kind of grounding that we can devise very specific tailor-made strategies, which I'm happy to talk about later. I don't want to take up time, but we can come back to those. So hopefully that answers your question to an extent.
Thank you. So touching on the alternative student finance campaign, this is a campaign that has been being driven by yourself, Asha, and a few others. What can be done, and I know Stephen touched on it as well, what can be done to really make that a reality, bring that to fruition, and have a big win for Muslims in this country?
Yeah, sorry, I have to apologize. My internet went off, so I had to grab my phone and use my hotspot. So apologies if there was a bit of a cutting out. But in terms of the question, I think that's a really important question. I started university. I thought that alternative student finance would be a reality. So I'm not the person who started the campaign or sort of pushed from the start. It was already it should have already been there when I started university. We were in a similar position as we are now. I think the problem is we, as a community, I think as a collective, I think there's been a bit of a defeatist mentality. And I think the key thing, and I think what can make it reality, is if everyone who cares about this is empowered to do at least something. I think the most important and most effective thing that you can do is sit with your MP, literally book a meeting, sit with them and explain to them why this is important. The government are committed. In terms of all the challenges Muslims face and all the barriers Muslims face, I think this is level one. There is no resistance from the government. They have the solution, they put it into law, and it's just about getting it over that hurdle. So I think people need to understand that it's not difficult. It just requires effort and attention. That's all it needs. And unfortunately, there hasn't been effort or attention for years. So yeah, the basic thing you can do is sit down with your MP and talk about this issue. If you want to find out more information, there's a website called equalaccesstouni.com. There's a place where you can click to get involved. You can DM me, and I will literally have a one-to-one Zoom with you to explain the background so you can be well informed when you meet your MP. But that's the best thing you can do. If you want to get more involved, if you're an organisation, I think, as I've said before, what's really worked with this campaign, because I've been pushing this for years and writing to universities minister, etc. It's about the networks. It's about finding out who who can do this one small thing that needs to be done. Finding out, it's about coming together. Mosques is a really, really, really great place. So if you want to really be your MP, Friday praise, you have a lot of people. What's worked is doing a short announcement and then getting people to sort of collectively sign a letter. That's one thing you can do. So I think it's about figuring out, okay, what can I do? What's a small thing I can do? And I think the simplest thing is somehow lobby your MP, sit with them, meet with them. If you want to find out more, please do log into the go onto the website, and I can share more information on that too. I think the key is just empower yourself. Don't wait, otherwise you'll be wasting another 10 years, and it'll be 2023, and we'll talk about the same thing. So,
well, let's hope not.
Yeah, exactly.
Stephen, do you have anything to add to, I guess, a bit more, maybe some insight that people can do, that maybe campaigns you've seen before that have reached some form of change?
Well, I think Asha's right. I think the personal connection between constituents and MPs is the key lever that we've got here, because all sorts of MPs with different views on lots of different things. If a constituent goes and says to them, look, this is really important, MPs will take note and will want to be seen to be responding positively and will be wanting to do something. So I think that personal connection, which can take a bit of time and effort, and It's not always completely straightforward, but it's definitely worth doing. And I think, you know, if that's the basis for the campaign, then we're in good shape. I just wanted to pick up on something Reza was saying earlier about the attitudes in universities to people of faith. I chair the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society, and we've looked particularly at the relationships between faith groups and local authorities. And you see some of the same attitudes that Reza was describing in the local authorities, maybe for slightly different reasons. But, you know, if you're a busy council officer, then you can be quite reluctant to get involved with a faith group over here, because, you know, if you talk to one of them, are all the others going to get offended with you? And there's an awful lot, and it's all very confusing, and isn't it easier just not to bother at all? And in any case, as Reza said, you know, these are all people who believe in God, so they're probably a bit peculiar anyway. And as the result of that has been, I think, that our communities have lost out on lots of really valuable contributions that faith groups could have been making for a long, long time, but have kind of not really been able to do. Now, what's happened over the pandemic is these local authorities have suddenly discovered that the only people who could help them to get food out to people who otherwise wouldn't have had enough food, and to communicate really important information about getting vaccinated and keeping healthy and safe and so on, it's been the faith groups. In my constituency, it's been the churches and the mosques in particular that the councils have had to work with, and our all-party parliamentary group carried out a survey of councils, and it's turned out that has been the case all over the country, that the people who've had the motivation to help during the pandemic and have also had the capacity, the resources to do something, have been the churches and the mosques and the places of worship. So I'm hoping that experience during the pandemic will change people's minds a bit. And certainly the local councils have said to us they found this experience of collaborating with faith groups a really positive experience, that the people they've worked with in the faith groups have been very committed, they've been very professional about how they've set about it. You know, sometimes the councils think all these people are really interested in is trying to convert people, and the councils have discovered that is not the case. So I'm hoping that we're going to see some change of attitudes, and maybe that will, you know, allow us to move on to a more positive understanding of the contribution of Muslims. But I'm hoping that we can affirm Muslims, and changing the student finance system is going to be an important part of that. We have to say to people, you're a Muslim. In the UK, we affirm Islam. We recognize that people coming in at our community and work in our community from a starting point of committed Muslim faith are making a really positive and valuable contribution. I hope we can move on to that. We certainly haven't been able to provide that often in the past.
Can I just quickly comment on that, Sadiq? I think that is an important point, and from an educational perspective, it's essentially an issue of inclusion or exclusion, as the case may be. I mean, you know, we hear daily almost, you know, in educational circles about the importance of inclusion, of being inclusive, and lots of money is spent on you know, inclusivity and diversity and equality and those things, and rightly so. But it's always kind of struck me as a bit strange that we seem in higher education yet to be so blind to the fact that we are, admittedly inadvertently, I'm not saying anybody's doing this on purpose, but you know, we end up actually excluding, you know, Muslim students without even potentially knowing that this is happening. You know, exactly because I mean, I speak almost daily to you know, my own undergraduate and postgraduate students who tell me about their experiences, and it's really interesting to hear that how they feel that even without anybody pointing a finger at them, even when everybody's trying to be really inclusive and really kind, they almost invariably end up being or feeling excluded because they feel that their faith marks them out as anti-intellectual, as anti-education, because certainly in the post-prevent you know, world, there's been such a problematization of Muslims and especially in the context of education and Islamic schools and madrasas, and it's received so much bad press that's in the public imaginary. That's become the kind of the key association between Muslim people and education, that they're somehow against it. To say nothing of the Trojan horse affair, the fiasco that was in 2014 in Birmingham. So I think that's part of the issue. And what's interesting is that issue doesn't exist in the same way prior to university. So it's well known that the UK does not have a secular education system before higher education. It's sort of written into the Education Reform Act, and there's supposed to be a kind of a daily act of worship, and depending on the kind of majority faith in an area, it can reflect that faith, etc. So students, potentially Muslim students, maybe grow up not being prepared for the shock that's almost waiting for them as soon as they enter university, which is a very different atmosphere, where you have this kind of quite exclusive and what can feel a very violent almost kind of secularity, for want of a better word. At the same time as you have from the other flank the pressures that come from Prevent with its kind of modes of religification. So it really is an impossible position, I think, for many of our Muslim students. So I think that's where we need to look at the issue of the awarding gap. You can't kind of blame individuals or lack of talent or lack of effort, or that doesn't seem to tally with the evidence that there is.
Yeah. One element of some of the things that you were mentioning, Reza, is there have been a lot of complaints from Muslims about the lack of access to, I guess, faith-based or faith-sensitive, culturally competent counseling or well-being support at universities. And I guess this question here is going to be directed at Stephen. How do you think universities should go about addressing this issue?
Well, I think maybe Reza will be able to speak about this with more expertise than I can. But I certainly think that a faith-sensitive approach is really needed. And it's needed in lots of settings. One issue that I've done a bit of work on over the last couple of years is the introduction of the new requirement for relationships and sex education in schools. And, we saw in Birmingham quite a lot of difficulties about that. I think the problem has been a lack of faith sensitivity in the way some of these things have been done. Now, my own local authority, London Borough of Newham, has worked quite hard on this, and I think they've been successful in listening to people, understanding what the concerns are, and making sure that when the syllabus was implemented, it didn't give rise to the kind of concerns that people worried about. And on the whole, I think Muslim parents and other parents have been happy with how that's been done. But it does require some proper faith sensitivities, some proper listening to people, not sort of just assuming this is a kind of ignorant knee-jerk reaction that people are expressing. But no, we need to understand what those concerns are and recognize that they're valid and need to be addressed and not ignored.
Yeah, agreed. Reza, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I definitely agree. I think faith sensitivity is central to all of this. I think it needs to happen at an institution-wide level, at sector-wide, I should say. I think universities can and should be doing more to really begin to counter this narrative that religiosity somehow equates to anti-intellectualism or to a lack of rationality. I think surely by now we understand that the human experience is far more nuanced and colorful and interesting and exciting and complicated than some of those 18th, 19th century Enlightenment ways of thinking, which have their own merits. I mean, I'm certainly not, I'm not sitting here calling for, calling for us to get rid of, the notion of secularity from universities. Not at all. I don't think that's at all the case. But I think certainly Muslim students, but I think also, religious students more generally, often do walk around with a sense of guilt or a shame. And if we're talking about, as I said, inclusion and belonging critically, I mean, this is the key issue that comes up again and again, that students don't feel that they belong. I mean, from working class students who also attain lower in the national data, we often hear that they feel that their lack of belonging kind of corresponds to class-related issues. It's about the ways that people speak and the way that the room looks, etc. I think for faith-based students, a key issue, a key ingredient in ensuring their belonging is to make sure that they feel welcome. I'm saying despite here, but having faith does not mean that you do not belong in an intellectual space. Partly, I think, and universities can't take the credit for this because this is student-driven. I mean, there is the decolonization movement that has been happening for quite some time now. Which is pretty grassroots up and student-driven. And one of the concerns of that is to begin to challenge exactly everything that we would take for granted in terms of higher education. And that does mean questioning, the kind of role of non-Western or non-dominant forms of knowledge, and bringing up very positive role models. I mean, we saw during the pandemic, it's sadly ironic that it took the pandemic for there to be some really positive images of Muslim scientists and doctors, the people who led the Pfizer vaccine, or indeed all the wonderful NHS doctors and nurses who were Muslims, who turned up on the news daily and were shown to save lives. Here you have incredibly clever, really intelligent, very intellectual people who have faith. And I think universities need to really, really support their students in that. They really need to help to counter that narrative.
Can I just make an obvious additional point while agreeing very much with what Reza has been saying? That there is, I think, quite a lot of scope here for cross-faith collaboration, for people of distinctive faiths who, in terms of what they believe, are believing quite distinctive and different things, but actually share values in common and share quite a lot of experiences in common as well, including being rather condescended to by others. And I think there is good scope for people of distinct faiths to work together to try and change things.
Yeah, I wanted to ask one question to yourself, Asha. I know you, during this period of campaigning for alternative student finance, you've had the opportunity to speak to quite a number of Muslim students that have either gone to university and potentially self-funded, or decided to leave and not study at university at all. Were they mentioning these like same lines of a lack of belonging or a lack of feeling important with regards to the university education system as well?
Is it just me or?
Yeah, one for you, Asha.
Sorry, it just cut off for a second, so now you're back. Sorry. So you said a lack of belonging and?
A lack of maybe consideration or importance. Was that the theme that you have noticed come out from?
Definitely, and I think I say it's defeatist, and I think that's the problem, which is they don't even believe that they could be considered. It's almost as if it's their own sort of problem, and they like that the thought of actually saying that this is hard and that they're struggling and they need a solution, it's almost too much to ask. So I know I felt that way. I know my siblings just thought, okay, I can't go to university. So I think they have very low expectations of the society that they live in because of their faith in it. And I think that's the sentiment that I get. And I'm trying to challenge that and say, you have to believe that you deserve an education in this country. You are a citizen. You deserve to be able to, have a professional career, have a fulfilling life. You deserve that just as everybody else. But at the same time, why do they feel that way? And I think it is the narrative as that's being given to them in all aspects. Being Muslim is politicized in a lot of ways, and the idea of saying even the alternative student finance, if you even say it's a Sharia compliant structure, that makes people uncomfortable, when ultimately it's a very ethical and inclusive system that will support students and will be very attractive to a lot of students, regardless of their faith. So I do think there is a very strong belief that because I'm Muslim, I can't have the same sort of opportunities and the same sort of requests as the next person next to me, even though I went to the same school, I grew up in the same place, I got the same grades. There is that inherent belief, and I think it does come from what they're constantly told and also what they constantly have to experience. If we are looking at the situation, it's been 10 years. The government did commit to this in 2013, and they haven't delivered. Yes, we haven't campaigned hard enough, but they haven't delivered as well. So there is two sides to the story, and I think the government do have to do a much better job at allowing students to feel, and Muslim students to feel included, and give them a sense of belonging. Because once they feel a sense of belonging, they do so much better. They contribute more to society, and they give back. So it's a win-win for both. And so I think that is a very, very significant problem.
Yeah, Reza, you mentioned decolonization of the curriculum. I've heard this spoken about quite a few times. What does that actually mean? Like, when you speak about that, what does that mean? How does that play out?
Well, it's it's a movement that in earnest sort of really took off in South Africa initially, from 2015. And we've since seen it kind of replicated elsewhere around the world, and not least, the very famous Rhodes Must Fall campaign, at the University of Oxford. In a nutshell, it's about challenging all the issues, all the concepts, all the kind of rules and regulations, everything that is taken, all the received wisdom of higher education, essentially, right? And recognizing that higher education, as we know it, as excellent as it is, and as wonderful as it is, and I will defend it to my last day, not least as a university lecturer. In the West, in the way that we've come to know it and engage with it, is very much largely a product of the colonial period and the modern period, modern European period. And so a lot of the received wisdom that then animates higher education as we know it, just kind of assumes those truths to just still hold true. It assumes a certain kind of hierarchical relationship between the West and the non-West, between what is considered, good, valuable knowledge or true knowledge or, proper knowledge and traditional forms of knowledge, which are almost dismissed out of hand as being ridiculous or irrational. And that, of course, works very significantly in terms of racism and racialization of minoritized people. But it also then extends into these other areas of social life, which include, gender, which include sexuality, which include clearly religion as well. Because this is the time also where, where you have on the one hand, rapidly kind of secularizing Western societies and the kind of rationalization that goes along with that, whilst at the same time you also have Christian activities or ideas from Christianity that are doing a lot of work out there in the colonized world. And so it's about really challenging the legacy of those ideas in higher education, and not just challenging them in a sort of a theoretical way, but realizing that a lot of the problems that we have, if we're serious about improving higher education, this is probably one of the key root causes of many of those problems. This is the reason why we're not as inclusive as we could be. This is the reason why we have such awarding gaps, and they tend to affect the usual suspects. They're really predictable in terms of who they affect. So it's asking us really to not just rethink our curricula by just adding some black and brown names into our reading lists. It's really kind of challenging us to almost rethink a bit more fundamentally how we think about higher education, about learning and knowledge and the co-production of knowledge and inclusion.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Reza. Final question to Stephen. I think both Reza and Asha have mentioned a number of barriers that Muslims face currently within education. And actually, surprisingly, a lot of that is centered around universities. What should universities be doing right now? Let's say short term, or the immediate fix that they could do right now to help issues faced by Muslim students. I know, just a suggestion, there is the APPG definition of Islamophobia that I guess hasn't been widely accepted as of yet. Is that one thing? And what else would you advise universities at this moment?
I think that is helpful, and I mean I do think the fundamental thing is the funding, which is not in the gift of the universities, isn't it? It's for the government to fix. But you know, there are the Brampton Manor Academy in my constituency has done an amazing job over the last few years in giving lots of young people, many of them Muslims, the opportunity to go on to great universities and on to. So I think that kind of collaboration between schools on the one hand and higher education institutions on the other, making that pathway seem a bit less formidable, encouraging students doing their sixth form studies, doing their A-levels, that it's realistic for them to aspire to great universities and to do well. So and of course the universities need to reach out as well, and I think a lot of them are trying to do that now, and so we have seen some real progress. But I think it's in the collaboration between universities and schools that's the most fruitful route to this, in addition to sorting out the finance system.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've not heard that collaboration point be made as I guess strongly before, and it's completely valid. I've had the opportunity to visit Brampton Manor, and what they're doing is absolutely incredible for sure.
Yeah. And you know, they make sure the youngsters going through sixth form have the opportunity to spend some time at a university, to listen to university lecturers, and just to take down some of those barriers which for too many families at the outset seem pretty formidable.
Yeah. Reza, do you have anything to add with regards to what should universities be focusing on?
Well, I mean, not much in addition to what I've said. I mean, the only thing that I will just add, maybe as a finishing note, and also to follow on from what Stephen said, is that we also cannot forget that there is an immense amount of, you know, wealth in terms of knowledge and experience just out there in our communities, and what all educators must do when we build connections, including, as Stephen says, between you know, schools and universities, is to be much more open-minded and inclusive in terms of how we make use of all this wonderful knowledge and experience that's out there. So I think currently, certainly, and people like me are trying to do this, but you know, the best sort of research we can do if we're genuinely interested in inclusion and social justice in education is to be as collaborative with communities as possible. You know, rather than treating them as sort of either objects of research or people that we might turn to if we need something specific, genuinely building partnerships so that, and it goes also to the decolonization movement as well, for which I have a great deal of respect, exactly because it's student driven. I think we have to be careful that we don't fall into the, you know, into the comfort zone of our known categories, you know, of BAME and just, you know, the traditional understandings of sort of racism. We have to step outside of the comfort zone, generate new forms of knowledge that really understands people's experiences as they are right now, the lived diversity that we have, rather than our sort of imagined ideas of diversity that we've sort of inherited, as it were. So I think that would be sort of what I would be in support of, really.
Great. Well, we've just come up to time. I think the things that we have spoken about, again, as I mentioned right at the very beginning, very broad, many areas of the barriers Muslims are facing at the moment. And I think a lot to take home for people that are listening. I'd like to thank all of you, Reza, Stephen, and Asha, for giving your Tuesday evening for this really, really important conversation, and all those that are listening as well. So yeah, assalamu alaikum, everyone, and please take care. Bye, everyone.